So thank you so much, Serge, for that really nice introduction. And Serge, as he mentioned, was the one who suggested that I come and speak with you guys. And I think our work, we worked together on a couple of stories, as he mentioned, this past year. I've been at the New York Times for about a year and a half, and so I would optimistically say that this means that those must have gone well and were a helpful experience for him and his group at ICSI, the Computer Science Institute, and Berkeley. And so I think that it is really important for researchers actually to work with journalists on privacy and security stories, because this is something that is crucial, really, I think, for our readers and listeners and our audience now, as these platforms come to influence so much of what we do in society and really are affecting everyone's daily lives. And so I want to talk about how things, some experiences that I've had working with academics and researchers, as well as what we might do in the future. But I think before that, I want to take a look back to where we were before. And when I started covering technology, this was about 10 years ago. I started as a tech blogger at the Wall Street Journal, and I was covering things like Farmville, and I was going back and looking through some headlines to find old stories. And 10, 15 years ago, I think tech coverage was really about the excitement and the newness of tech. I covered this and ended up accidentally getting addicted to Farmville for a while. We would cover things like Twitter passing 10 billion tweets. Just a lot of excitement over just the growth of this industry and the opportunities it could provide. And some of this was also pretty serious. I don't know if you remember just a few years ago, with the Arab Spring, there was so much excitement about what social media could bring and the democratizing effects that it could have. And so a lot of tech, it was providing jobs, and the coverage was overwhelmingly positive. It was even to the point of I would sometimes write stories like this, just describing to people what was going on with the Google Doodle that day. And this is really, honestly, quite embarrassing for me. And, I would go through and I was writing live blogs about product launches. This was what tech journalism was at that time. And, to be fair, this wasn't all that was going on. So around this same time, 2009, there were some researchers, again, up at Berkeley, that did a project called No Privacy. Get it? It's a pun. No privacy. No haha. Right. So they went through and looked at the tracking and beacons and so forth that were on a number of popular websites. This is just a graphic of theirs from what was a very popular website at the time, MySpace. And they were seeing what was passed to third parties. And this is just really a standard, I think, in privacy investigations and research. And my editor at the time, Julia Angwin, had been covering MySpace, and she started becoming interested in what all this data was that was being passed along and what is happening here. There's actually some kind of exchange, they're exchanging people's data. This is nuts. And so she got together with Ashkan Soltani and Chris Hufnagel and some of the researchers at Berkeley. And I had the good fortune of being on this team, and we started to do a series of stories that became the What They Know series. And this was the first in that. And it kind of replicated the work that had been done at Berkeley. This was the first time that I think we were really working closely with technologists to show readers kind of what was actually happening online. And so we went through and looked at the tracking technologies that were on the 50 most popular websites, a bunch of children's sites, popular apps, and so forth. And this actually became a 2-year series that had a number of different, took a number of different looks at privacy issues, both from the commercial side as well as the government side, and relied on privacy and security researchers in a number of different ways. So I'll kind of show you a bit more about what that looked like. So this article was taking a look at a Google technique that bypassed Safari settings. So Safari at the time was blocking third-party cookies by default, and it didn't block cookies if the user interacted with a form, right, that was sending information to a third party. So what Google was doing was loading an invisible form and then automatically sending it, and thereby being able to place a third-party cookie despite cookie blocking, and this went counter to what Google was telling users it was doing. And this actually came from a researcher who's now at Princeton, Jonathan Meyer. He had found this, and we replicated it at the journal and talked with Google about this and got their response and figured out what was happening, and Google stopped doing it and got in some trouble and so forth. So this was something that was coming from an academic technologist and really inspiring, leading directly to an article. And then another way in which I've found technologists to be incredibly valuable is in explaining technology that now this is old hat to everybody, but back in 2011, this was the first article that was really exploring the use of stingrays by law enforcement or MC catchers. And this was kind of funny, like the article was about someone who was accused of being a hacker. It was a tax fraud case, actually. And the federal law enforcement had found him by tracking his air card. And he was convinced that the only way they could have done this was through an IMSI catcher. And he ultimately was correct, but his defense attorneys, and he had several, because he sounded absolutely bananas, I think, to them, insisting that there wasn't a proper warrant for this. They were using, the law enforcement was using this technology that I'm sure sounded just completely made up to the public defenders, right? And so, he had filed these voluminous legal documents, and in order to determine whether he was, accurate in his suppositions, I relied on a lot of experts in who had been studying IMSI catchers and knew, their capabilities. So that was really key to determining that he was in fact correct. And then another way in which we used technology was actually Ashkan and some other technologists sometimes embedded with our team or were hired as contractors. So in this story, we looked at price discrimination online and automated, a scan of a number of sites using different, from different zip codes coming in, using different browsers and so forth to see if they gave different prices. And we found some that in fact were, especially based on zip code. I think we bought a couple staplers. I still have one of them. It's working well. It's $15 stapler. I think that seems like really expensive, but I guess it's lasted a long time, so fine. So this was, kind of the start, I think, of mainstream publications really relying heavily on privacy and security research in this way. And technical outlets have done this for quite a while, but I think it's a different thing when you're trying to talk to the general public, right? But now this field is expanding, and a lot of it does deal still with privacy and security, but I want to give you a few examples of what this looks like now. Some of it is about algorithmic bias. So this is Julia Angwin went on to ProPublica for a few years. She's now starting her own newsroom called The Markup. It's funded by Craig Newmark. But they've really been interrogating algorithms. This article was about a risk assessment algorithm, and it showed that it had more false positives for black defendants and more false negatives for white defendants, and was kind of interrogating what that meant in terms of bias. There are other reporters now who, to really great effect, do first-person articles about privacy and security. So this is Kashmir Hill. She worked with Surya to kind of outfit her entire home with a bunch of Internet of Things devices, and then see what data they were sending and what data they were leaking. And I think that is helpful to general users because they can see themselves kind of in these stories, and it makes some of this research concrete to them, right? There's another reporter, there are a few reporters at Vice who do similar things. So there was one who has gone and purchased location data from bounty hunters that was being funneled through the phone system, and that has led to a lot of important policy questions. And then at the Times, we've actually really beefed up our technology investigations and have been working more with technologists and have several programmers on our team now. We are looking at privacy and security and disinformation and a number of critical issues to technology right now. This article, The Follower Factory, was about fake accounts on Twitter. And you can see this chart basically shows the blue dots are different Twitter accounts that are following this one celebrity account, right? And you can see the red lines are, the y-axis is when the follower joined Twitter, and then the x-axis is the number of followers that this celebrity has. And so those red lines represent people who kind of magically followed this guy all at the same time, and also magically were created in little bands of time, like created almost simultaneously. And so you can especially see that top line, all those people were created basically on the same day. And this was able to demonstrate that the business of selling fake Twitter followers was a big business, and that Twitter, for whatever reason, was not conducting this sort of analysis. And I mention this not because it's about security and privacy, but because the team on this worked with researchers, with students and a professor at Columbia to do some of the computational work here. And those folks actually got bylines and credit lines on the article that was in the Times. So this is another option, I think, that is worth exploring. If this is something that interests you, in terms of actually demonstrating that newsrooms are now open to pretty deep collaborations, I think, with academics. So now I want to get to the work that we did with the group that Surge is part of. So some of you might know that they worked on something called the App Census Project, which conducts dynamic analysis of free Android apps. And they do tens of thousands of these. They have a whole lab. And last year, they published a study showing that they studied almost 6,000 kids' apps and showed that more than half of them were sending data possibly in violation of COPPA to third parties. And that got some really excellent press and got some attention. But my thinking on reading that was that we could go a little bit deeper and try to kind of explore more about what was happening with this. So you can still check them out. They're at appcensus.io now. And what we ended up doing with this, we did a couple of stories. So the first one was still focused on children's apps, but we took a deep dive into a company that had dozens of apps that were sending pretty personal data to third parties, to advertising companies. And this company was interesting because they were saying that they were not a children's app company. So they were saying that their apps, didn't fall fully under COPPA because they were geared toward families as a whole. They were in Google's For Families program. They weren't just geared toward kids, so therefore they could use an age gate that was, pretty easy to get through, indicating that you were not underage incorrectly. So their contention was that everything was fine. But to tell you a little bit about these apps, they had names like Fun Kid Racing, which maybe gives you an indication that it's for kids. I don't know. So it seemed a bit problematic. And the researchers had told Google about this and had really, done a lot of hard work trying to analyze a lot of apps that seemed to be indicating that they were for families as a whole and not targeting kids, when in fact they seemed to be targeting kids. And Google's response was, especially about this Fun Kid Racing, the company that made Fun Kid Racing, was that no, this is right, these are for families, they're fine, they don't need to conform to these stricter requirements. And so that is what this article was focusing on. We looked at this company, it was a great example. We also went and found kids and parents whose data had been shared. So I think that can be really important in conveying your findings to the public, if you're able to show that this is affecting a real person. And I think that really takes it out of the theoretical and makes it concrete for people so they can understand the importance of these privacy rules and the importance of where their data is being sent. So the child that we spoke with and his mom, his data had been sent to advertisers and it was resulting in him seeing inappropriate ads in these kids' apps. And we also took a look at apps on iOS as well as retesting the Android apps from the initial study to see if any changes, if there had been any fixes made, and there weren't really. And I think that is important to note because as journalists, I think the App Census project was really focused on Android apps because they're able to analyze those at scale, right? Whereas the iOS apps are more difficult to dynamically analyze at scale. And so as journalists, we want to be fair as possible and actually analyze both types of platform. But we're not able to do that at scale, so we just took 10 apps to do a small check. And what we found was that there were apps on both platforms sharing advertising identifiers in ways that could be in violation of COPPA, but apps that shared things like very personal data, such as location data, those were only seen in our tests on Android. So that was the first story. And then, in talking with the team at ICSI, one of the things we realized was that a lot of the data collection involved location. And this seemed like a really sweet spot for describing to the public kind of what this data sharing and data collection means, because it's something that is widely collected and yet is intensely personal. So we started looking through the data from the research that the App Census team had done, and they were very generous with their time and shared the actual SQL databases with us. And so we were able to look through that data more effectively than if we had just used the web interface. And we built out a major article about the entire location data ecosystem. And so this was the image from that article, the cover image. And this is actually location data from a couple of days in New York City. And it looks like a map, right? It looks like you're looking at the city at night and these are lights or something, but that's not the case. There's no map under here. This is just location data that we've colored orange. And it's so precise that and so pervasive that it makes a map that, if you know New York, is pretty recognizable as Manhattan and Brooklyn and New Jersey. And it was just jarring to get this data. But we in fact did a lot of other work on this story. I'll talk a little bit more about it. So we found more than 75 location data companies, and some of this we found by going through the Berkeley ICSI data and seeing which companies were collecting location data. And then some of it we found through other means, because a lot of this data sharing is done on the back end. So we weren't able to detect something if they were collecting the location data as first-party data and then transferring it to another entity after they had collected it themselves. But the data from ICSI really helped inform our initial look into what companies might be, really big in this space. We also did some additional manual tests, again, of iOS and Android apps. And one of the things that we became very interested in was the actual user flow. And I think that some of you, I'm excited to talk to SOUPS folks in particular, because I think I have a lot of interest in what users themselves are actually experiencing with privacy and security online, because that's sort of who I represent as a reporter. And so in this case, there is a permission flow, right? But we saw that the majority of apps that we looked at that were gathering location did it in a way that the user flow mentioned only the sort of logical, helpful reasons for collecting the location, such as, this one on the left says, we'll use your location to recommend local teams and players that are relevant to you. This is for a sports app. And actually, they're also using it for advertising and sending it to companies that send it to hedge funds. And the same with, this is the Weather Channel app on the right. It just says you'll get personalized local weather data alerts and forecasts. And in speaking with users, they look at these and they think, this is what my data is being used for, right? They see this and think there's no need to then look at the privacy policy further, because this seems to be a summarization of the privacy policy as relates to location data. And I think that things like this are really important for helping us explain why users are making these privacy and security decisions that seem to not be in their interest. because they don't even know that something is going on that might not be in their interest, right? So in addition to that, we obtained the location data set that was on the previous slide, and that was from a confidential source that had access to this data. And then we went through, the source was concerned about privacy, so was very concerned about us identifying people in that data set without their permission. So we went through a very long process of getting people who would agree to give us their home and work location so that we could see if they were in that data set. So one of the women that we found, she was actually my sister-in-law's friend. They work at the same school, and so she gave us her work address and her home address, and we could see that her phone was appearing in the data set in the evenings at home, and very clearly during the school day at school. And there were some other kind of interesting tidbits in there. It was following her to another house every so often, a few times, and I asked her who that was, and she said that that was her boyfriend's house, except that that was actually her ex-boyfriend at the time. They had been broken up, but she was still mysteriously going to his house, and this was in the data, and she was a little bit, embarrassed by this, although she laughed it off. But it was following her to her doctor. I mean, we found people in this data who we didn't identify, but we could see that people were tracked at Planned Parenthood clinics. People were tracked who were pretty clearly associated with the mayor of New York City, so they would be at Gracie Mansion and follow the mayor to a known event on Staten Island, and then they would go back home wherever on Long Island. And in conforming to the source's wishes, we didn't track these people, but I mean, you could see that there are a lot of problems with this, and I think that kind of brought home to people what could be done with this data. So that kind of tells you, I think, the state of play right now, and I only think that this is going to get more important going forward. I think newsrooms now are also more open to coverage of technology that is really interrogating the power of these companies and platforms. I mean, these are, some of the biggest companies in the nation and in the world right now. And, I know a lot of people who work at these companies, and they do great work. But I think that it is valuable anytime an entity has that much power to really look critically at what they're doing with that, especially when these are entities that affect everyone's daily lives now. So, but I'll still try to do a little bit more convincing. All right, so what are the benefits that I've seen working with academics? So I think especially for folks who are interested in user privacy and security, I think the ability to really reach the average user can be incredibly valuable, and is not necessarily something that everyone's able to do with an academic paper. I mean, your work is fantastic. I've seen a lot of it, but you've spent 4, 5, 6 years getting a PhD, however long that takes, and you obviously can't expect the rest of the public to have that sort of knowledge, but this is so valuable to them to understand what is going on, at least at a basic level. And I think that working with the general interest media is one way to do that. I think it also enables you to reach policymakers in a way that sometimes more technical work is not. So I think a lot of lawmakers and policymakers, read the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so forth, but they're technical knowledge, you might have noticed, is not always up to the same speed that you'd want it to be, although they have some great advisors now who are improving the way things work there on Capitol Hill. I think that from your standpoint, journalists can sometimes help you overcome certain technical barriers. So for example, the server-to-server transmissions that are not able to be analyzed from a perspective of just seeing what data is being transmitted from a phone or site or what have you. That is something that, although a journalist can't necessarily get the exact information you need, sometimes going through and getting company records or talking to employees who've worked at these companies and doing other sort of traditional investigative reporting work can at least shine a light on what is happening behind the scenes. And then from my standpoint, I think the most valuable thing about working with technologists is their ability to provide proof. And why do we need proof as a journalist? Because I'm sorry to say this, but people lie. And so companies lie, or they don't tell you the full truth. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I think having the actual data to back up your suppositions or the data to confirm or deny your hypothesis as a journalist is incredibly valuable when you're then trying to ask the technology company whether it is in fact taking enough steps to protect its users or sharing user data in a certain way. Okay, so what constitutes proof for us? So sometimes, if we have multiple sources saying that something is happening, that can be proof. It's not as helpful to me as something like documentation, company documents, actual records of events that are happening from a journalistic standpoint constitutes proof. And where technology comes in is in providing observational data. And I think that this sort of empirical journalism is key for investigations. And I think that we actually have a lot in common in terms of wanting to provide proof and wanting to get empirical data to show that something is happening. A lot of articles that are very good you can cover a topic without having this sort of observational data and you can make an impact. But I think it is more impactful when you can actually show what is happening and it's not as much of a theoretical discussion. So I'll show you a bit of this in action. As I mentioned, we studied the apps sending the location data. And the fact that we were able to document these user flows and show that it's pretty unreasonable to expect a user to know if the notification just says, we're going to use this for this location data to identify your local sports teams, and then you're selling it to hedge funds. That's kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but unless you confront the company with that image or that data, they are going to continue along the lines of saying that their users understand this or what have you. So I think that was really valuable. And then this is from a few years ago. We were covering a company that was collecting some pretty personal information and passing it along to car sales lots. And they kept saying that they were collecting this, but users knew it, and it was really protected anyway. They were encrypting all their data and whatever. But we saw the data that was being sent, and kind of looked at. It was in a bit of a jumble, but it didn't seem like really encrypted. And it turned out that, among other things, they were using ROT13, which we were just like, this isn't secure. And then they accused us of hacking them. And like, it was super weird. But the fact that, we were able to show this pretty precisely and describe what they were doing, I think kind of put the lie to the idea that they were protecting their users' data. So that was kind of fun. Okay. So I will admit that there are some differences between academia and journalism. So in academic and even industry research work, there's a lot more space. There's more room for nuance. This is something I just accept. Like even that location story that we did, that was maybe 2,500, 3,000 words. And that's a pretty big story. So obviously that is not the amount of space that one gets for an academic paper, right? In my experience, I've found that there is, with great reason, more interest in process. So, you're trying to make things that are replicable and can be expanded upon, and you want to fully explain that process. That's not something that's as much of interest to a reporter. And then from our angle, as I mentioned, we're more concise. We are really looking for real-world examples. So if you have something where you think it might be possible to find somebody who has in fact been affected by whatever problem you're seeing, that could present a really good opportunity for speaking with somebody in the media about that. But you should also keep in mind that we have to do a lot of confirmation and seek extensive comments. So, even on those initial stories with the Wall Street Journal, with what they know, part of my job at that time as a young reporter was to contact dozens of companies and get them to confirm that, this was the data they were sending. These were the trackers. Were they surprised by the fact that they had 100 trackers on their site? And actually getting comment from them. Even recently, I reached out to more than 70 location tracking companies and app makers and so forth. And this takes a long time, and so that's something to keep in mind if you're working with a reporter. We can't mention a person's or company's name without seeking comment from them and making a really big effort to do that. And that's even if it's mentioned in like a graphic or something that you might think would not be that important. Okay, so some of the things that we're looking for, if you're thinking of, if you're wondering kind of what might indicate that you are working on something that should be shared with the wider public or might be a good bit of research to take to a journalist. So we're looking for examples of harm to real people. So something that is directly affecting users. And I think a lot of you are working on things that are directly affecting users. Like, it's in the name of your conference. So I think widespread effects are also important. And sometimes I'm sorry to say this. I mean, yeah, if something is a flaw with a Google system or an Apple system, I mean, that's going to get more attention than with a single small company, even if it is a disastrous thing that they shouldn't be doing. If it's affecting a lot of people, if it's affecting a large company, that's going to be more newsworthy. I also really look for opportunities for accountability. So in the location story that I mentioned, the one with the children's apps, that I think is key because it shows some issues with Google's system of determining which apps were appropriate to highlight as being for families and which apps were appropriate to get this special designation that indicates to the average user that this is something that Google has approved of as being for families or for children. And so I think that is an accountability piece where we can then try to get some sort of response from the company or from regulators or lawmakers that this is something that should be looked at more closely. It doesn't always work, but we like for there to be opportunities for that at least. There are a few ways to work with folks in the media. So you can have a traditional news report on an academic paper. That's the most frequent thing, and that is great. I think most of what I work on are taking academic reports and making a journalistic sort of extension of that. That's another way to do it. And then, in some cases you can have a more full integration. So either there are actually roles now for technologists in certain newsrooms, and some newsrooms are open to a deeper collaboration, either working concurrently on an academic line of research and a journalistic article, or as we saw with the Columbia example where they were studying the fake followers on Twitter, actually working on the article together and getting bylines and credit for that. It's somewhat unusual, but I think newsrooms are increasingly open to this because covering technology requires such a level of expertise that a traditional journalist is not going to have been trained on. So I think we're really looking for that sort of expertise. Okay, so there are a few things to keep in mind. One that I run into a lot is that investigative journalism can actually take months, frequently takes months. So I cannot tell you how many times I've heard from somebody who is terrific and doing terrific work that they're going to publish a paper in the next 2 weeks, and would I like the exclusive on it, which sometimes works, but for me and for investigative journalism, that's not the case. If I am going to try to then find some kind of data set that's relevant to what you're looking at, or find actual humans who've been affected by this flaw and get them to agree to talk to me on the record and have their pictures taken and all this stuff, and contact 20 companies that have this problem and get them to respond to me, that is not going to take 2 weeks. That takes a long time. And it depends on the complexity and what we're trying to do, but I think it's important to get in touch with folks pretty early in the game. Okay, on both sides, it's important to keep in mind that technical research is not magic and reporting is not magic. I think these two worlds kind of have this view of each other as the reporters sometimes think, oh, I'm talking to this technologist and they can just go out and get this data for me, and they don't realize that this is going to take some painstaking steps. And technologists likewise, as I mentioned before, sometimes will say, well, you can just report it out. There's some sort of magical fairy dust reporting powder that I'm gonna use and get people to talk to me. No, what I am basically, I'm like a spammer. I contact a high volume of people and one person agrees to talk to me and the other people just slam the door in my face. It takes a while. And it's really boring and tedious work. Okay. Unfortunately, journalism is still driven by space limitations. And this is always tough for me to have a conversation with somebody who's been doing work on a large team, and then the leader of the team gets quoted, or one or two people get mentioned, and the rest of the team is referred to as the team with a hyperlink. And I'm sorry about this. When we're cutting down for space, I think it's more important for the general reader of the story I'm writing to get a little bit more information on whatever the problem is than to get full information on how the research worked or who is involved in it. And I agree, I'm sorry about this, I actually am, but that is something that I just want to make sure everybody is aware of. The audience I'm writing for is not a technology audience. And I think it is important to understand that from a couple of perspectives. One is that, we're gonna have to explain things at a pretty basic level. Another really important thing, though, is that things that seem old hat to experts such as yourselves and seem like maybe not news might in fact be news to everybody else. I hear so many times from folks in tech when we're writing on privacy stories that this isn't news. Everybody knows this. The users have agreed to this. And it's just not the case. Or even worse, they will say, well, only the stupid users don't know this. And that is just ridiculous. I mean, our readership is intelligent, and they still don't know what exactly is going on. So I think if something is annoying to you, and you think it's just really bothersome that this is the way it is, but you kind of figure that everybody knows that this is what is happening, that might actually indicate that this is important to publicize. And then finally, I think that it is important when you're working with journalists, to ask for a fact check. I always do fact checks with folks. I think I make errors, so I want to make sure that those errors don't get into print. I think this is something that you should ask for. It's easy to make a pretty technical slip up that actually makes a big difference, and the reporter might not know that. However, that does not mean that you get to read the article ahead of time. I think it's reasonable to ask to have the reporter read to you or tell you what is being said about you or your research specifically, or say that you want them to check the facts with you. But we don't give articles ahead of time to anybody to read, because if we gave it to somebody who is a technical expert, then the company involved would also have cause to say, well, we want to read this entire article ahead of time so that we can prepare our public relations response to it and so forth. And this is just not something that we do. But I would encourage you to ask any media you're working with to do a fact check. And that about wraps it up for me. I think I have some time for questions, if anybody has any. I'm happy to answer them. And we'll just, I don't know if the microphones are on.
And when you ask a question, please state your name and affiliation so the rest of the room can know.
Hi, I'm Gus Andrews. My only affiliation right now is that I'm writing a book called Keep Calm and Log On, which is about just sort of privacy and security training for everyday people. One of the things that I find as I go around and talk to people about privacy and security is, at this point in time, a certain amount of learned helplessness. They've read a lot of stuff in the news, and they've read a lot of, they're like, everybody can know everything about me, particularly when it comes to things like location data, where they've just heard a lot of things. What do you feel like is your responsibility as a reporter, and then what are the techniques that you use in order to make sure that people don't fall into that sort of sense of overwhelm? And yeah, what's your sense of how to do that?
I mean, I don't know that I see myself as having a responsibility to make sure they don't feel that way. So I would agree that I see a lot of learned helplessness as well. And there are 2 points I want to make about that. One is that I think this sense of learned helplessness unfortunately distorts the understanding of whether people are agreeing to the data sharing economy. So they might have a sense of learned helplessness that I feel, as a reporter talking to these people, it's like palpable. And that translates into them agreeing to things, and then the company interests saying, well, they've agreed to it, so therefore everything is fine. So I think that that is a really great point. I think that in trying to explain these things to people, it's important to highlight things that they can do themselves. And unfortunately, so on almost every story we do, on many stories we do, we will say, like, here's how you look for these settings, here's what you do to try to limit this. But realistically, there's not actually a lot you can do. I mean, there is a lot you can do, I'm not phrasing that correctly, but you can't prevent all of this. Like, this is a sense of learned helplessness because you, in fact, cannot prevent all of it. It would be insane to go and opt out of every single one of these companies' practices. It's not feasible. It would be a full-time job. So in addition to talking about that, I think we've increasingly started to talk about options for regulation and legal action. And that's not something that I can advocate for, but I think that it is important to highlight certain possibilities for policymakers and regulators to take a look at what is going on, because they should not feel a sense of learned helplessness that
Sure.
an average user might.
Sure, thank you.
Sorry, I need a sip of liquid here.
Well, hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for your excellent talk. My name is Corey Fackleris. I'm a graduate student right now at Carnegie Mellon, but I used to be a journalist myself. And so I have something of an insidery question for you.
Sure.
I know myself, I would sometimes get frustrated. I would advocate things in print or to our staff, but our company would not follow those practices in their business. And so I just wonder, have you ever gotten any blowback internally or externally from the New York Times also being a tech company and tracking users using some of these third-party data technologies themselves?
So I would say this is something that readers point out with good justification all the time, and I agree with them. Our newsroom is separate from our business side, and so I don't get any blowback internally because they can't say anything to me. I'm just covering whatever the news is, but I didn't mention it in here, but because I didn't know if it was a little too insidery, but on all of these tests that we're doing, we're always testing our own sites or apps or so forth. So this was true at the Wall Street Journal, and it's true now at the New York Times. So on the location story, I went through and tested the New York Times apps, the team did, and we don't collect location except for IP address, but we mentioned that in the sort of technical sidebar, right, that we had tested this, and this is what we did. I did an article recently on dark patterns in e-commerce, and it was based on some work out of Princeton, and they were looking at e-commerce sites, not at media sites or travel sites or anything like that. But I felt it was important to mention anyway that if you go to try to cancel the New York Times, you have to either chat or call somebody who runs through a script of like, don't go, or whatever they say. I'm sure it's very annoying. And I mentioned that, but even so, I mean, readers, we asked readers to respond about dark patterns, and that was the first thing they mentioned. Trust me. They were like, you do this yourself. I'm like, hey, not me personally. But yes, I think it's incredibly important to highlight. And that's how we do it. We test ourselves and mention ourselves in the story.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Dave Crocker. I'm a consultant. I'd like to ask you to expand on something that you touched on, which is the working relationship with researchers. Now, you mentioned the reporting process that reacts to publications, and that's really not the focus of the investigative work you do. But I assume that sometimes it's triggered by research that gets published.
Right.
Similarly, I assume sometimes you folks come up with a focus that you want, and then I'm wondering whether you also identify a research site that might be worth a collaboration. And talking about these two, this kind of mixed initiative and what the relationship is for each of them could be interesting.
Sure, sure. Yes, so it does happen both ways. I find that if we come up with something ourselves, there is usually a researcher who is, if not actively engaged in a study of that subject, then at least interested in it and starting to look into it. Simply because there's a small number of technology journalists who are doing this work, and there's a very large number of researchers. So what I will do is I'll start to ask around the researchers I already know who might be working on X topic, and usually get directed that way. So I think the process in terms of me reaching out to researchers usually works that way. And sometimes I think there is a dialogue in terms of my explaining to them, similarly to what I did in this presentation, kind of the things we're looking for, the things that are important for being able to reach readers and put things into concrete terms for them. So I think I've done a bit of that education as well. And honestly, when you're a reporter, over time you go to conferences like this, you talk with people a lot. If they're investigating privacy and security problems, you see similar faces over time. If you don't know the person specifically, you know somebody who knows them. I mean, that's part of my job, right? So I think that's how it has worked from my end. And fortunately, knowing people over time, I also will hear about new research subjects that are kind of bubbling up within the community. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Hi, my name is Baka. I'm a researcher at UBC. I was just wondering how ethics come to play in journalism. Mm-hmm. Do you only report things that have been ethically approved at the university? And also, do you also seek for ethics approval when you intervene your users and things like that? How does ethics play in the journalism space?
Right, so we don't have a review board the way that academics do, but we do have an ethics editor. So we have certain standards. They're not quite the same exactly as they would be in an academic setting. So, if we're, like, our entire job a lot of the time is talking to people, so I guess that would kind of be like human subjects, which would require a lot of perhaps approval in a research setting, and for us that is just what we do, so that would be silly to get that approved. But when we are doing things like if we get access to user data, like with that location data set, we talked with our ethics editor and our attorneys to make sure that we were conducting this in an ethical manner and not going to be revealing the names of people who were in this data without their permission and things like that. So there is a process, but it's somewhat different from the research setting. In working with a researcher, we don't require them to have gotten ethics approval, but it certainly would have to meet our ethical standards. So we're not going to be, hacking into a system and getting data from that. And, we need to make sure that we are considering potential terms of service violation. And, so these things are definitely considered in this sort of work, but not exactly in the same way.
I think I'll ask the last question, which is, as researchers, if we think we have something newsworthy, but do not already know someone in journalism, what do you recommend as a way for us to reach out and contact journalists to, and how to present what we think might be of interest to them? What is the best way to go about doing that?
So yeah, you should just give everything to me personally. No, I want all the stories. So I think the best thing to do is to try to think of journalists whose work you value, and whether that's at a place like the New York Times or the Washington Post, or I think Vice and Motherboard have really been doing excellent work. Wired does good work. So I think finding the work that is most like what you think would be a good presentation of the work you're doing is a good way to do this. And journalists should be pretty easy to find. I mean, most of us either, some people have their Twitter DMs open, which I don't do, but you know, you can get my email address is everywhere, and you can email people or tweet at them and what have you. And I think journalists are open to receiving stories. I would say don't get discouraged if you know, a particular thing you're working on isn't of interest to the reporter. You know, I think then it might be good to at least develop a dialogue then with them of, you know, what they're interested in, and you can describe your interests to them. I think reporters, tech reporters in general, are interested in hearing from security and privacy researchers. It's a really important topic right now, actually. So I wouldn't hesitate to just drop somebody a line, especially if you're in the same town that they're in or something like that, and just talk to them. Okay? Thank you, guys.